In September 1908, a doctor poured chlorine, a known poison, into the drinking water of an entire American city. No permission from any government agency. No warning to the public. When the residents found out, they sued him for poisoning their supply. His defense in court, that adding the poison was exactly what made the water safe to drink. The man on trial was Dr. John L. Leal, the sanitary advisor to a private water company in New Jersey. He had a court-ordered deadline. He had 99 days to deliver what the law called pure and wholesome water to a city that hadn't had it. He chose chlorine because he had spent more than 15 years of his life watching what happened to cities that didn't. He was willing to bet his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom on that one decision. Every glass of tap water you have ever poured started with what came next. Most of you have never heard the doctor's name. The reason you haven't is the story you're about to hear. To understand what Leal was up against, you have to remember what American city water looked like in 1900. The glass looked clean. The water tasted fine. It was not clean. Typhoid fever, cholera, dysentery. These were the silent occupants of municipal water supplies across the country. You drank them without knowing, and sometimes you died. And usually you just got sick and recovered, and you never connected the cup to the weeks of fever. People coped the way people always cope. They boiled their drinking water when they could afford the fuel. They drank beer instead of water at midday, which is one reason lager became the working man's drink of the century. They moved further from their wells when the death notices got bad, then moved back when the notices quieted. The cities kept growing. The pipes kept pouring. The scale was easy to forget because it was ordinary. Typhoid killed roughly 35,000 Americans in 1900, the year the federal government first tried to count. During the Civil War, more Union soldiers died of diarrheal disease and typhoid than died of bullets. That is the baseline. That is what urban life looked like on a normal day when nobody in particular had done anything wrong. Jersey City, just across the river from Manhattan, was one of the worst cases in the country. By the late 1890s, its typhoid death rate was running somewhere between 80 and 100 per 100,000 people, among the highest of any major American city. Children died fastest of all. The cause was plain to anyone willing to look. The water came from a polluted creek, then from a polluted reservoir, and nothing in the system was killing the organisms living in it. Filtration, the technology that had begun to work in other cities, was expensive, slow to build, and politically impossible to fund on the deadline Jersey City was about to be handed by a court. That was the water John Leal had been hired to fix. Leal was not, at the start, a waterman. He was a country doctor. He had been born in a small town called Andes in the Catskill Mountains of New York, gone to Princeton, then to Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons, and in 1886 opened a medical practice in Paterson, New Jersey. He was 28 years old and just starting out. Paterson was a manufacturing city with the diseases of a manufacturing city. He was named city physician the same year he opened his practice. Within 6 years, he had become its health officer. For nearly a decade, he ran the public health office of a town where the water came from the Passaic River, and a version of the same river came back through the sewers a few miles downstream. He saw what that meant in real time. He signed death certificates for children who had drunk from a cup that morning and were dead by the weekend. He watched his own father go through the gruesome last weeks of a waterborne illness. The more he saw, the more he came to believe that you could not fix the problem by treating the sick. You had to fix the water. By the late 1890s, the East Jersey Water Company had noticed him. They offered him a different job, sanitary advisor, the person qualified to look at a water system and tell a board with a doctor's authority whether the supply was safe to drink. Leal took it. By the early years of the new century, he had moved over to advising the Jersey City Water Supply Company directly. He had spent more than a decade watching what unsafe water did to human bodies. He had also begun to form a private conviction the public health establishment did not yet share, that you could kill the germs in the water without first filtering them out, if you were willing to add something stronger than they were. Other engineers were talking about chlorine in test tubes. Leal was the one thinking about what it would mean to turn it on for the whole city at once. The substance he had in mind was chlorine, and the word for adding it in a courtroom or a newspaper would be poisoning. By 1904, Jersey City had spent enormous money on what was supposed to be its solution: a new dam at Boonton, a new reservoir, 29 miles of aqueduct, a mountain water supply drawn from the Rockaway River watershed, treatment works that did not quite treat. The whole project was meant to end the typhoid. It didn't. Within 2 years of the switch, the city's typhoid death rate was still around 20 per 100,000. It was better than the old supply, and worse than nothing for a system that had been built to end it, and it was nowhere near what the original contract required. The contract was the trap. Years earlier, the Jersey City Water Supply Company had promised to deliver water that was pure and wholesome. The company was a private corporation, paid by ratepayers, and the city fathers had written that phrase into the deal as protection, the legal standard for what they were buying. By 1900, with the typhoid still rampant, the city fathers did what they could do. They sued. The case sat in court for years, while everyone waited for the Boonton Works to fix the problem on their own. By 1906, the Boonton Works had not fixed it. The case went to trial that February in the Equity Court of Vice Chancellor Frederick W. Stevens. 40-something trial days, hundreds of exhibits, expert witnesses for both sides, arguing about the chemistry of sewage, the biology of typhoid, and whether the new supply could ever be made safe by conventional means. In May 1908, Stevens produced his opinion, finding for the residents: the water was not pure and wholesome in the legal sense of the word. The company had to do something about it. Here is the line in Stevens' order that changed everything. He did not tell the company how to fix its water. He told them to build intercepting sewers along the Rockaway, to keep sewage out of the watershed. Or, and this was the clause, to use other plans or devices capable of producing water of the required purity. The escape hatch. The door left open in a court order for someone to come along and propose a method that was not filtration at all. Leal read the order carefully. He read it as the door he had been waiting for. On July 19, 1908, John Leal crossed the Hudson. He took a ferry from New Jersey to Manhattan and walked to an office at 170 Broadway. The man he came to see was George Warren Fuller, perhaps the most respected sanitary engineer in the United States. A man who had designed some of the country's first modern filtration plants and was, by 1908, on the record arguing that mechanical filtration was the only responsible answer. Fuller did not believe in chemical disinfection. His field was filters. He had spent his career building them, and he had a name to protect. Leal's pitch was simple. The court had given him 99 days. The court had left other plans or devices open. He wanted Fuller to design and build a continuous chlorination system at Boonton, a system that would feed chloride of lime into roughly 40 million gallons of water a day, and, by doing so, kill the typhoid bacteria that the filters weren't catching and the reservoir wasn't stopping. Fuller, who had spent his career in the opposing camp, agreed. They shook hands on it that day. What followed was the most compressed engineering job in the history of American water treatment. Fuller worked from principles he had already established years earlier for feeding aluminum sulfate into a different plant, and he adapted them to chloride of lime. Workers erected the system on the Boonton site through the long New Jersey summer. Leal pushed it through, day after day, against a deadline that left no room for a pilot study, a public hearing, or any of the normal steps a city would expect for a change of this size. 99 days after the handshake, on September 26, 1908, chloride of lime began flowing into the Boonton supply. 40 million gallons a day of treated water headed south toward Jersey City. It was the largest continuous chlorination of a municipal water supply anywhere in the world. There had been smaller applications before, emergency interventions in England during typhoid outbreaks, but never continuous, never at this volume, never for a private company waiting to be sued for the change. Leal did not announce the experiment. He did not run a small pilot. He did not wait for an academic body to bless it. He turned it on. 3 days later, on September 29, 1908, the second trial opened before Justice William J. Magee. The question the court now had to answer was narrow. Had the chloride of lime system Leal had just installed satisfied Stevens' other plans or devices clause? Was this water chemically treated, pure, and wholesome within the meaning of the original decree? Or was it, as the residents' lawyers intended to argue, an adulterated supply, dosed with poison, unfit to drink? The lineup of expert witnesses tells you what kind of fight this was. For the residents, for the people suing the company over their own drinking water, the court had assembled what was, in 1908, the most authoritative roster of sanitary scientists in the United States. William T. Sedgwick, the MIT biologist who had helped build the academic discipline of public health. George C. Whipple, one of the founders of modern sanitary engineering. Earl B. Phelps, Charles Edward A. Winslow. These were not cranks. These were the establishment. They were willing to testify on the record that adding chlorine to public drinking water was reckless, that a known poison had no business in a municipal supply, that the only legitimate way to deliver safe water was to remove the contamination, not to pile on another chemical to drown it. For the defense, Leal himself, Fuller, and Rudolf Hering, the German-educated civil engineer who had essentially invented American sanitary engineering as a formal discipline. The defense's argument was, in its own way, just as heretical, that pure did not mean what the residents thought it meant, that a water could be dosed with chloride of lime and emerge safer than the unadulterated supply had ever been, that adding poison in the precise dose that killed bacteria without harming the people drinking it was the definition of purification, not its opposite. 38 days of trial, 3,000 pages of testimony, the two greatest concentrations of public health expertise the country could produce, lined up against each other, arguing in front of a single judge about what a single English word, pure, actually meant when applied to drinking water. Behind the experts on both sides were the residents of Jersey City, who only wanted their children to stop dying. And on the witness stand, when the prosecution tried to suggest that Leal was in this for personal gain, that he expected to make a fortune from the innovation he had given away, the doctor is reported to have told the court plainly that he did not know where the fortune would come from. He had never patented the process. He had charged no licensing fee. He had given the method to the company that commissioned it. The trial was not about his profit. It was about whether a man who had spent his life watching children die of dirty water was allowed to dose it with the one substance he knew would save them and call the result pure. On May 9, 1910, Justice Magee issued his ruling. For the defense, the chloride of lime system produced in his finding pure and wholesome water within the meaning of the original decree. The residents lost. Chlorination, as a method, was now legally blessed for the largest water supply in the country to that point, and the precedent rippled outward almost immediately. Within a few years, cities across the country had begun to follow Jersey City's lead, one after another, because the precedent held and because the method worked. Leal did not patent the process. He charged no licensing fee. He did not write a textbook or accept payment for the method. By the next year, he was back in private practice, advising water companies that came to him because of what he had done. He never became famous. For most of the 20th century, his name did not appear in the histories of water treatment, which gave the credit to other engineers and to projects that followed in the years after. That correction came only in 2013 in a book-length study by the environmental engineer Michael McGuire, who set out to recover what the record had missed. And here is the thing McGuire documented when he went looking. In the years after the trial, chlorination spread because it worked. The American water supply, chlorinated, filtered, and engineered by the people Leal had pulled together at Boonton, is widely credited with saving more lives than almost any single public health intervention of the 20th century. Typhoid in the United States fell from roughly 100 cases per 100,000 people at the turn of the century to vanishingly few by the 1980s. The same water that Leal had been sued for poisoning is, in a very real sense, part of the reason the average American born in 1980 could expect to live 30 years longer than the average American born in 1900. Leal himself did not live to see any of it. He died on March 13, 1914, in Paterson, New Jersey, 55 years old. He is buried in Cedar Lawn Cemetery in Paterson. For almost a century, his grave was unmarked. The man who gave the world the legal precedent that turned on the safety of its tap water, who gave it away without patenting or profiting, who was sued for poisoning and vindicated in court, that man's name was not on a stone. Every glass of tap water you have ever poured, the one this morning and the one you will pour tomorrow, exists because a court in 1910 accepted John Leal's argument that pure and wholesome included a small, precisely measured dose of something the prosecution called poison. He took a risk no one had authorized him to take. He took it in front of the most established experts of his era, knowing he could be wrong, and that if he was wrong, he would be remembered as the man who poisoned a city. The cost of getting it right turned out to be the same as the cost of getting it wrong: obscurity, an unmarked grave, and a world that did not remember his name for almost a century. Modern historians had to recover him. The water you trust this morning recovered itself in 1910 because one man agreed to be the one who took the fall. You do not think about the water because he thought about it for you. If you have ever looked at your tap and wondered where the safety actually came from, that is the kind of story we chase at this channel. Subscribe, and you will see more like it.